Most people think if you gave AI access to all the data, it would build a better March Madness bracket. More information, better decisions. But when I tested 6 different AI models against Vegas, a seed structure, and a human bracket, they all did something unexpected. They played it safe. Not just a little, but consistently. Hey, this is 3-Putt Polly, aka the Golf Tech Nerd, where I'm a regular golfer using data to make smarter decisions and play better golf. Now I'm applying that concept to March Madness. I wanted to see how these models actually make decisions, not just what they pick, but how they think. So I built a controlled experiment using 2 intentionally different prompts. In the structured version, the models were constrained. They were guided to stay within historical norms, things like typical upset rates, seed behavior, and consistency across the bracket. In other words, they were not allowed to get too aggressive. In the open version of the prompt, all that goes away. No limits on upset frequency, no requirement to stay consistent. Just use whatever information you think matters to build the best bracket. This created 2 completely different decision environments, and that's what drives everything you're about to watch. So this isn't just about who they picked, it's about how constraints changed decision making. This experiment includes multiple layers of comparison. First, 6 independent LLM brackets: ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, Grok, and Perplexity. Each model generated a full tournament bracket using both prompts. Second, an AI consensus bracket. This is just a simple aggregation of the 6 models' choices, each game decided by majority selection of those 6 models. Third, I created 3 baselines: Vegas odds, which is market expectations, most likely to win the tournament; a higher seed wins bracket, which is sometimes called pure chalk; and a human bracket, my own bracket, which I created before running any of the AI prompts just to avoid any influence from the models. So we're not just evaluating what the models picked, we're learning how these picks compare to market intelligence, simple heuristics, and human decision making. But to understand what these brackets actually represent, we need to look at how the models are making decisions. So I didn't just collect the picks, I collected the reasoning behind the picks. And when you line up all 6 models side by side, the patterns are extremely clear. First, every model is heavily anchored in the same core metrics. Across all 6 models, they kept going back to the same stats: adjusted offensive and defensive efficiency, turnover percentage and turnover margins, rebounding rates, especially offensive rebounding, shot profile efficiency, rim attempts and 3-point rates, and pace and possession control. You see this consistently. Houston is picked because of elite defense, rebounding, and turnover margin. For example, Houston is consistently advancing past higher seeded offensive teams, and specifically because of defensive turnover rate and rebounding margin. Duke is picked because of top-tier 2-way efficiency, top 10 offense and defense. So Duke is repeatedly selected in the Final Four and championship paths based on its top-tier efficiency on both ends of the floor. Arizona is picked because of balanced scoring and high overall efficiency. Arizona appears across multiple deep runs due to its balanced scoring profile and pace-driven offense. Even when the teams changed, the reasoning doesn't, which, if you think about it, is both really smart and kind of predictable. Second, when models select upsets, they only do it when the numbers justify it. For example, McNeese over Vanderbilt is not framed as a gamble. It's framed as a statistically supported outcome. Transition efficiency advantage, offensive rebounding edge, and exploiting Vanderbilt's defensive weakness on the glass. Texas over BYU is not framed as volatility, it's framed as matchup optimization. Perimeter athleticism, ability to run shooters off the 3-point line, and disrupting BYU's primary offensive structure. Across the board, upsets are only taken when they can be explained with structure. There are no coin flip picks. There's no randomness in the reasoning. Now third, there is clear evidence that the models are actively controlling risk. This shows up explicitly. One model describes a second-round decision as a deliberate decision not to overextend Cinderella risk. That's not prediction, that's bracket construction strategy. And you see it repeated. Upsets are introduced early, but rarely extended into deep runs. Mid-majors are allowed 1 win, then replaced by higher-seeded, more stable teams. That creates a very specific bracket profile: controlled volatility. Fourth, there's a consistent override of seeding when contextual data is available. Across multiple models, the same types of adjustments show up. Injuries: Texas Tech downgraded after losing a key player. Location: Houston upgraded due to geographic advantage. Momentum: teams on winning streaks elevated. Conference strength: Power Conference's teams boosted. This means seeds are not being followed blindly. They are being re-ranked based on context. And that's generally correct, but it also introduces bias toward known signals. Finally, when you look at championship selections, the convergence is almost complete. Every championship pick follows the same template. Top-tier efficiency on both ends of the floor. Balanced offensive and defensive profile. Strong performance in predictive metrics. And alignment with Vegas odds or market expectations. Examples include Duke, elite two-way efficiency, strong market favorite. Arizona, top-tier offense and defense, multiple scoring options. Houston, defensive dominance and rebounding stability. Michigan, high-level half-court creation and efficiency. No model selects a high-variance team. No model selects a flawed profile. No model selects a team that wins in unconventional ways. So when you step back and look at all of this together, the conclusion is pretty clear. These models are not trying to predict chaos, they are trying to eliminate it. They are optimizing for stability over volatility, efficiency over variance, and plausibility over upside. And that leads to a very specific kind of bracket, one that looks smart, one that sounds analytical, but one that may systematically miss the very thing that defines this tournament, unpredictability. Now, if you're still with me, I really appreciate it because I am truly nerding out on data this time, a little deeper than I normally go. But thanks for sticking around. Hopefully the rest of the content keeps you here longer. So let's talk about the round of 64. This is where you'd expect the most variation. It's the beginning of the tournament. This is exactly where the patterns we just outlined start to show up. 32 games, this is where the upsets live. But what actually shows up is controlled behavior. Across the 6 models in the structured dataset, 59.4% of first-round games had full agreement across all 6 models. That means 59% were unanimous across the models. Model picks aligned with the higher seed 87.5% of the time, and aligned with the Vegas favorite 87.5% of the time. That's 7 out of 8. Now here's the key detail. Even in games where models disagree, they're not behaving randomly. They're selecting from the same type of teams. Mid-majors with strong efficiency profiles, power conference teams that appear underseeded, and teams with specific matchup advantages. So you don't get chaos, you get bounded variation. Different picks, but from the same pool of acceptable outcomes. For example, McNeese versus Vanderbilt appears as a candidate at 12-5 upset across multiple models. But in the structured bracket, only 2 of the 6 models actually take McNeese. While the AI consensus, Vegas, seed, and human brackets all stayed with Vandy. Texas versus BYU shows up as an 11-6 upset based on perimeter defense and 3-point suppression, but again, the majority still stay with BYU. And in an 8-9 game like Utah State versus Villanova, the disagreement is narrow and efficiency-driven, not random. And this is where one of the most important patterns shows up. The classic 12/5 upset, the one most of us pick almost on autopilot. Historically, this is one of the most common upset profiles in the tourney. Multiple models explicitly recognize that. They cite efficiency gaps, mid-major strength, shot quality advantages, and yet, across the actual picks, this upset is minimized more often than it is embraced. So the models understand the pattern, but they don't act on it. That's the first clear signal that these systems are biased toward stability. Moving into the round of 32, the pattern tightens. Upsets from round 1 don't propagate. In multiple cases, a lower-seeded team wins in round 1, then immediately loses in round 2. And that's not accidental. One model explicitly describes this as a deliberate decision not to overextend Cinderella risk. For example, when McNeese is selected to beat Vanderbilt in round 1, that upset path is immediately shut down in round 2 against Nebraska. The same kind of logic shows up in other second-round splits. Kansas versus St. John's is mostly Kansas, but one model flips it to St. John's. Nebraska versus Vanderbilt splits as well, but still within a narrow band of analytically justifiable outcomes. So what you're seeing is not just prediction, it's bracket shaping. The models are allowing controlled early upsets, but preventing those outcomes from compounding. That creates a bracket that looks realistic, but avoids volatility. So by the time we reach the Sweet 16 and Elite 8, the diversity drops sharply. So at this stage, decisions are almost entirely driven by two-way efficiency, defensive stability, turnover margin, and rebounding strength. For example, Houston selections are driven by defense and rebounding. Arizona selections are driven by offensive balance and efficiency. Duke selections are driven by top-tier performance on both ends. So by this point, teams like Duke, Houston, and Arizona begin appearing in a majority of model paths, regardless of how earlier rounds played out. Different teams, but identical logic. At the Final Four level, the convergence becomes obvious. You don't get 6 completely different outcomes. You get overlap. Multiple models selecting the same teams, often through different bracket paths. At this stage, teams like Duke and Michigan appear in multiple Final Four combinations across the 6 structured models, often through different regional paths. Duke appears in 4 of the 8 total Final Four slots across the 6 models, and Michigan appears 4 times as well. Arizona appears twice, while Houston and Iowa State each appear once. At the championship level, a small group of teams dominates selections. Each champion fits the same profile. Top-tier efficiency, balanced offense and defense, strong alignment with Vegas expectations. No model selects a high-variance team. No model selects a flawed team. No model selects a team that wins in unconventional ways. So even though the paths differ slightly, the destination is tightly controlled. Now we move from what they pick to how those picks compare. First, Vegas. Across the full structured bracket, model selections aligned with Vegas 82.8% of the time. The AI consensus aligned with Vegas 95.2% of the time. In other words, these models are not operating independently from market expectations. In many cases, they are reinforcing them. Second, the higher seed wins profile. Across the full structured bracket, model selections align with a higher seed 83.6% of the time. The AI consensus aligned with a higher seed 98.4% of the time. Third, the AI consensus bracket. This tends to be even more conservative because it averages 6 similar models, it amplifies agreement and suppresses outliers. And finally, the human bracket, which, full disclosure, that's mine. This is where differences start to show. Human selections typically include more aggressive upset picks, allow deeper runs for lower seeded teams, and show less consistency but more upside variance. Gotta take a risk if you want to make the money, right? So the key question becomes, are the models actually predicting better, or are they just reinforcing the safest possible version of the bracket? There's a clear strength in what these models are doing. They're excellent at identifying strong, balanced teams, efficient statistical profiles, and stable performance indicators. In other words, they're very good at avoiding statistically weak picks. But that comes with a trade-off, because March Madness is not a stability-driven system, it's a variance-driven system. And these models systematically underweight randomness, they avoid high variance outcomes, and they control upset exposure. So while they may produce clean brackets, they may also miss the very outcomes that decide the tournament. So when you step back and look all of this together, the conclusion is pretty clear. These models are not trying to predict chaos, they're trying to eliminate it. They optimize for efficiency, stability, and predictability. And they treat uncertainty as something to reduce, not something to leverage. That works well in most predictive environments, but March Madness isn't most environments. It's a tournament where variance is the game, where outliers aren't bugs, they're features. And the unexpected isn't noise, it's usually the outcome. So the real question isn't whether these models are smart, because they are. The question is whether this type of intelligence, structured, efficiency-driven, risk-controlled, is actually aligned with the problem we're trying to solve. Because if the system is built on unpredictability, then a model that avoids unpredictability may always be one step behind. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? All right, so now we've got the brackets, we've got the reasoning, and we've got a pretty clear picture of how these models are approaching the tournament. At this point, it's just about watching it play out. If you've got a CBS Sports account, you can follow along with the bracket in real time and see how these picks actually perform as the games happen. I'll be tracking everything as well, how the models do, how the consensus does, and how it compares to Vegas in the human bracket. If you enjoy this kind of breakdown, hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more of this and how all this plays out over the tournament, and I'll keep updating this as we go. If you want to see how we bring this same decision-making framework back to golf, where most of this channel lives, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the follow-up. And as always, golf is never perfect, neither are brackets, but good data makes these games a lot more understandable. Thanks so much for watching.